reason for why the Supreme Court of the United States has struck down President Trump's ability to use tariffs. IEPA, they say, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. This is a judgment from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts. I'm reading through this decision right now, which just came out literally in the last couple of moments here about the president's tariff authority. Worth noting that this is coming out just before he's set to go in front, of course, of Congress, a joint meeting of Congress, to talk to Democrats and Republicans. He has been touting tariffs constantly. Okay, now I have a good idea of who has joined this opinion. Roberts, the Chief Justice of the court, has delivered the judgment of the court. Also, Sonia Sotomayor, a liberal justice, Alana Kagan, another liberal justice, Neil Gorsuch, a conservative justice appointed by President Donald Trump, Amy Coney Barrett, another justice appointed by President Donald Trump.
All right, people, welcome back to Dr. John Podcast. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose sweeping tariffs was unconstitutional, stripping him of the legal foundation for his signature economic policy and sending him into a documented, recorded rage against his own appointees. The president publicly attacked the very justices he had helped shape, calling them a disgrace, and the court weaponized in one of the most devastating constitutional rebukes of his second term. This is not the kind of political skirmish that gets resolved with a press release or a phone call to friendly senators. This is a full-blown constitutional confrontation that strikes at the very heart of American democracy. A president publicly warring against the Supreme Court, attacking its legitimacy, shaming its justices, and threatening to find alternative paths around the constitutional constraints they have imposed.
And Justice Jackson, as well, appointed by Joe Biden, joined that decision. Worth noting that the two dissenting judges, Clarence Thomas and Kavanaugh, along with Justice Alito, all dissented from that decision. So pretty fascinating stuff there. The Supreme Court striking down President Trump's tariff policy, something that is not only likely to get a very strong response, to say the least, from President Donald Trump, but also could have a major impact on the current world order. The president imposing sweeping tariffs on nations all across the country, a baseline 10% tariff on countries. And just yesterday, President Trump was in Rome, Georgia, saying that tariffs is the most beautiful word in the dictionary, something he's often said since the campaign trail. He's had this full-throated embrace of tariffs, and now the Supreme Court striking down those tariffs just ahead of the president's most major domestic policy address. I'm just on the president's Truth Social account right now. No reaction from him yet, but we can expect.
The specific ruling that triggered this explosion was breathtaking in its scope and its consequences. 6 justices, including 3 appointed by Trump himself, concluding that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act cannot be stretched to justify sweeping peacetime tariffs that reshape the global economy without a single vote in Congress. The court was saying, in the most formal and constitutionally decisive language available, that the president had overstepped, that his expansive view of executive authority had collided with the constitutional architecture that the founders designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral power grab. And the 6-justice majority was not a narrow ideological split, not a party line division that could be dismissed as partisan judicial activism, but a decisive constitutional determination that cut across the usual conservative-liberal divides because the legal question was simply too clear to ignore.
A fairly strong reaction from President Trump, especially given, Steph, and I'll let you weigh in here too, the fact that a number of the justices that President Trump appointed to the Supreme Court himself joined this decision with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, appointed by President George W. Bush, striking down the tariffs here. This, of course, going to have massive repercussions. Again, we can expect a very strong response from President Trump. These tariffs have largely been his idea, something that he has championed, he pushed through, in some ways steamrolling Republican members of Congress, including his own Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who has repeatedly told reporters like myself he's no fan of tariffs, but has been willing to go along with the policy because President Trump has felt so strongly about it. Now, this is probably just going to release a total tidal wave in how things turn around here, in just how the tariff policies could be unwound. Again, a lot of questions about where things go from here, Stephanie? And again, I'm just trying to monitor everything I can to just get a good sense of where things are going. This, of course, just breaking literally in the last couple of seconds here, Steph.
The urgency of this moment cannot be overstated, because what the court just did was not merely invalidate a specific tariff program or block a particular economic policy. It reaffirmed a constitutional principle of staggering importance: the principle that the power to tax, to regulate commerce, to impose tariffs belongs to Congress and Congress alone. That principle is not a technicality or a procedural nicety. It is one of the foundational pillars of American constitutional governance, the specific mechanism by which the founders ensured that the people, through their elected representatives, would control the economic destiny of the nation. When a president can unilaterally impose tariffs that affect every American household, every American business, every American worker without a single vote in Congress, the constitutional balance that the founders painstakingly constructed begins to crumble. And when the Supreme Court steps in to reassert that constitutional boundary.
Hey, Nate, yeah, I know this is a major decision that we have been waiting for from the Supreme Court. There's a few important things that our audience should note about this decision. One is this does not impact all of the tariffs that President Trump has announced. These are only the tariffs that have been used under IEEPA, which is the acronym for the law the president was using to institute these tariffs. Now, this law has been on the books for decades, but Trump was the first president to try to use this particular law to institute new tariffs. And that is really what the justices were considering here. So there's another major question of what happens to all the tariffs that have already been paid under this statute from President Trump, all of these IEEPA tariffs. Are those funds that have already gone into the U.S. Treasury, are they going to need to be repaid to the importers and to the businesses that have, paid billions of dollars? I think the last update I was looking at recently said that the president's tariffs in totality have brought in as much as $287 billion to the United States Treasury in 2025. Again, not.
It is doing exactly what the founders intended, exactly what the system was designed to do, exactly what the conservative legal movement has been demanding for generations. The Roberts opinion is devastating in its clarity and its force. IEPA does not authorize sweeping peacetime tariff imposition, the Chief Justice wrote, and with those words, the court dismantled the legal foundation of Trump's most ambitious economic policy, the signature program that the president had been touting as the centerpiece of his second-term agenda. The congressional authority over tariffs was being reasserted in the most formal and constitutionally decisive terms available, not through executive order or political negotiation, but through the ultimate constitutional accountability mechanism, a Supreme Court ruling that settles the legal question for the entire country.
All of the president's tariffs are going to be impacted by this decision, but this is going to send major shockwaves through the Trump administration. As you noted, the president likely to be very upset about this decision. You noted the justices who ruled against the president, even some of those justices being appointed by the Trump. But that, I think, speaks to the fact that we have three separate and equal branches of government. The justices that are appointed, whether it be Supreme Court justices or your regular federal district judge across the country, you don't want those judges to feel beholden to the president that appoints them. And so this is an example of the judiciary being the independent branch of government that it is supposed to be. I know we've got our legal affairs correspondent, Ava Joy Burnett. I know she is in the office and she, I'm sure, is pouring through this decision as well. And I'm anxious to get her take on what she reads out of this decision. But this is really just a massive ruling that we have been waiting for a few months now. And the question is,
the six-justice majority was not asking Congress to act or the administration to reconsider. It was declaring that the law does not permit what the president had been doing, that his interpretation of IEPA was simply wrong, and that the constitutional limits on executive power are not optional suggestions that presidents can ignore when they become inconvenient. The immediate political impact was devastating because the tariff program was not just a policy preference, it was the centerpiece of Trump's economic nationalism, the weapon he had been wielding to reshape global trade, to pressure allies, to confront adversaries, to deliver on his promise to put American interests first in the international economic arena. And now that weapon had been taken away, not by Congress or by foreign pressure or by market forces, but by the Supreme Court, the institution that Trump himself had worked so hard to shape in his image. The ironies piled up like wreckage after a train crash. The president, who had appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, watching those same justices vote to dismantle his signature policy. The conservative legal movement that had championed judicial restraint, watching the court exercise exactly the kind of constitutional oversight that it had been demanding for decades. The man who had promised to drain the swamp, finding himself trapped in a constitutional swamp of his own making. But what happened next was even more revealing, because Donald Trump's response to the ruling was not the measured acceptance that constitutional accountability might demand, not the careful acknowledgement that the Supreme Court has the final word on constitutional questions, but something far more alarming and far more consequential. He exploded publicly, documentedly, authentically, in a way that laid bare his fundamental view of the constitutional order. The court is weaponized, he said. The justices are unjust and a disgrace. His own appointees should be ashamed of themselves. The President of the United States was standing before cameras and essentially declaring that the Supreme Court's constitutional judgment was illegitimate, that the justices who had ruled against him had betrayed their principles, that the entire judicial system was being used as a weapon against him and his agenda. This was not ordinary political criticism, not the kind of complaint that presidents have made about adverse rulings throughout American history. This was something fundamentally different, a direct assault on the legitimacy of the constitutional institution that serves as the ultimate arbiter of legal disputes in the American system. The implications of this attack are staggering because the Supreme Court's authority depends entirely on public acceptance of its constitutional role, on the willingness of political actors to accept its rulings even when they disagree, on the understanding that the court's interpretation of the Constitution is the final word on legal questions. When the President of the United States publicly attacks that legitimacy, when he calls the court weaponized and unjust, when he says his own appointees should be ashamed, he is not merely expressing disagreement with a ruling. He is undermining the very foundation of constitutional governance, signaling to his supporters that the court's decisions can be disregarded, that the constitutional system itself is corrupt, that the only legitimate authority is his own political will and the power of his movement. This is the kind of rhetoric that authoritarian leaders use to delegitimize independent institutions, to establish that their own judgment supersedes constitutional constraints, to lay the groundwork for ignoring judicial rulings that they find inconvenient. And the escalation didn't stop with rhetorical attacks, because Trump then made the specific statement that most alarms constitutional scholars and legal analysts who understand the trajectory of authoritarian governance. He claimed that the ruling paradoxically gave him more power through alternative tools, through licenses, through new global tariff schemes, through mechanisms that he could deploy without congressional approval. The President of the United States was essentially saying, "You think this ruling limits me. You think the Supreme Court has constrained my authority. Watch what I can do with the tools I still have. Watch how I can route around this constitutional obstacle. Watch me find new ways to achieve my goals without any democratic consent or congressional authorization." This is not the response of a constitutional officer who accepts the system's constraints. This is the response of a power seeker who sees constitutional limits as obstacles to be circumvented rather than authorities to be respected. The specific alternative tools claim is genuinely terrifying when you understand what it represents. Trump is not saying he will accept the court's ruling and work within its boundaries. He is saying the court's ruling actually expands his power because it forces him to discover new legal mechanisms, new interpretations, new tools that he can deploy without congressional oversight. He is threatening higher tariffs on countries that play games with the ruling, promising terrible things to trading partners who dare to exploit the constitutional limits the court has imposed, and signaling that the constitutional constraint the court just established will be met with creative resistance rather than respectful compliance. This is the specific, forward-looking threat that makes this entire episode so much more alarming than a simple legal defeat for a particular policy, because it reveals a president who will not accept constitutional limitations, who will fight them, circumvent them, and publicly boast about his ability to find ways around them. The broader constitutional context makes this moment even more significant because the Supreme Court's ruling did not occur in a vacuum. It is part of a sustained pattern of constitutional accountability that has been building across multiple administrations, a pattern that suggests the courts are increasingly willing to push back against expansive claims of executive authority, regardless of which party controls the White House. The Biden administration's student loan program was struck down on similar grounds, the court saying that the executive branch cannot simply rewrite federal law through administrative fiat, that major policy changes require congressional authorization, that the separation of powers is not a suggestion but a constitutional mandate. The Trump administration's tariff program has now met the same fate, the court saying that emergency powers cannot be stretched to justify sweeping economic interventions, that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize what the president has been doing, and that constitutional limits on executive authority apply to all presidents regardless of party or ideology. This cross-administration pattern is the specific constitutional accountability story that legal analysts are most urgently highlighting because it suggests that the courts are not engaging in partisan warfare or ideological combat, but are instead fulfilling their constitutional role as the ultimate check on executive power. The Supreme Court said no to Biden's student loans, it said no to Trump's tariffs, and in both cases it did so with the same constitutional reasoning. Major policy changes require congressional authorization. The president cannot unilaterally reshape American law through emergency powers or executive orders. The separation of powers is a constraint that applies to all administrations. This is the sustained pattern that constitutional scholars have been waiting for, the judicial branch finally asserting its independence and its constitutional authority against the steady accumulation of executive power that has been occurring for decades. The specific Roberts opinion in the tariff case is devastating precisely because it is so carefully grounded in statutory interpretation and constitutional principle. The Chief Justice is not engaging in political commentary or ideological advocacy. He is doing exactly what the Supreme Court is supposed to do, examining the text of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, analyzing its legislative history, interpreting its provisions in light of constitutional principles, and determining what the statute actually authorizes. And his conclusion is devastatingly clear. IEPA does not authorize sweeping peacetime tariff imposition. The power to impose tariffs belongs to Congress, and the president cannot use emergency declarations to bypass the constitutional constraints that the founders established. The six-justice majority is not being activist or partisan. It is being constitutional. It is enforcing the limits that Congress wrote into the statute and that the Constitution requires. But the real story here, the one that makes this moment so urgent and so consequential, is the specific presidential response to the ruling, because Donald Trump's reaction tells us more about the trajectory of American democracy than any Supreme Court opinion ever could. When a president responds to a constitutional ruling by publicly attacking the court that issued it, by calling it weaponized and unjust and a disgrace, by shaming his own appointees and threatening alternative tools and higher tariffs and terrible things, he is signaling that he does not accept the legitimacy of constitutional constraints, that he sees the courts as obstacles to his will rather than as independent institutions entitled to constitutional respect. This is not the behavior of a democratic leader who accepts the rule of law. It is the behavior of an authoritarian figure who sees all institutions as instruments of power, who respects only force and loyalty, who will stop at nothing to achieve his political objectives. The specific shaming of his own appointees is particularly revealing and particularly alarming because it shows that Trump does not view Supreme Court justices as independent constitutional officers entitled to exercise their own judgment. He views them as his appointees, his instruments, his tools for achieving his political goals. When they rule against him, he does not see legitimate constitutional interpretation. He sees betrayal, personal betrayal by people who owe their positions to him and who should be loyal to his agenda. This is the language of patronage and authoritarianism, not the language of constitutional democracy, and it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what the judiciary is supposed to be and how it is supposed to function. The justices are not the president's agents. They are not supposed to be loyal to his agenda. They are supposed to interpret the Constitution and the laws according to their best judgment, regardless of who appointed them or what the president wants. The constitutional crisis that this reveals is not a matter of partisan disagreement or political conflict. It is a matter of fundamental institutional legitimacy. When the President of the United States attacks the Supreme Court's legitimacy because it ruled against him, he is undermining the very foundation of the constitutional system, the understanding that all branches of government are bound by the law, that no one is above the Constitution, that even the President must accept judicial rulings with which he disagrees. This is the specific crisis that legal scholars have been warning about for years, the moment when executive power becomes untethered from constitutional constraints, when the president decides that he is the sole judge of his own authority, when the courts become enemies to be attacked rather than authorities to be respected. And the fact that Trump is already threatening alternative tools and higher tariffs suggests that he is not just complaining about the ruling, he is planning to circumvent it, to find ways around the constitutional limits that the court has imposed. The specific alternative tools threat is the most alarming, forward-looking dimension of this entire episode, because it signals that the constitutional confrontation is not resolved. It is escalating. Trump is not accepting the court's ruling and moving on. He is telling the world that he has other tools, other mechanisms, other ways to achieve the same objectives without congressional authorization. He is threatening higher tariffs on countries that play games with the ruling, promising terrible things to trading partners who exploit the constitutional constraints the court has imposed, and claiming that the ruling paradoxically gave him more power because it forces him to discover new legal authorities that he can deploy without congressional oversight. This is the specific retaliation planning accountability dimension that makes this moment so dangerous, because it shows that the constitutional constraint being imposed is being actively resisted rather than accepted, that the president sees the court's ruling as a challenge to be overcome rather than a limit to be respected. The market and diplomatic consequences of the ruling are already becoming visible because the tariff program was not just an economic policy, it was a tool of geopolitical leverage, a weapon that Trump had been using to pressure allies, to confront adversaries, to reshape global trade relationships in ways that served American interests. Now that weapon has been taken away, not by foreign pressure or domestic opposition, but by the Supreme Court, and the consequences are immediate and tangible. Trading partners who had been negotiating against the threat of tariffs are recalibrating their positions. Markets are responding to the new reality, and the diplomatic leverage that the tariff program provided is evaporating as quickly as it was created. This is the practical damage that the court's ruling has inflicted on the administration's economic and diplomatic agenda, and it is the specific reason why Trump's response has been so explosive and so threatening. The Supreme Court's tariff ruling has created market volatility and economic uncertainty, while Trump's threats of alternative tools signal he is planning to circumvent, not accept, the constitutional constraint. The deeper question is whether this marks a turning point in judicial checks on executive power, or just another clash in an ongoing struggle. The legal analysis signaling tighter scrutiny on spending and war powers adds another dimension to this story, because it suggests that the courts are not just focused on tariffs and trade. They are increasingly willing to examine a broader universe of executive authority claims that have been expanding for decades. The same constitutional principles that limit the president's authority to impose tariffs also limit his authority to spend money without congressional authorization, to initiate military action without congressional approval, to reshape American law through executive orders and administrative actions. The courts are sending a signal that the era of unchecked executive power is ending, that the constitutional constraints that the founders established are being reasserted, and that presidents of both parties will face judicial scrutiny when they attempt to bypass the legislative process. But the specific Trump administration response to this signal is what makes this moment genuinely alarming, because the president is not accepting the reassertion of constitutional constraints. He is resisting it, attacking it, threatening to circumvent it. The weaponized court framing, the appointees should be ashamed statement, the alternative tools threat, the higher tariffs promise, the terrible things declaration, all of this constitutes a specific documented pattern of presidential resistance to constitutional accountability that is as alarming as any single Supreme Court ruling could ever be. The constitutional confrontation is not just about the specific IEPA statute or the specific tariff program. It is about whether the president accepts the Constitution's limits on his authority, whether he respects the judicial branch's role in enforcing those limits, whether he will comply with the rule of law or seek to escape it. The documented record of Trump's behavior in response to this ruling is the specific evidence that constitutional scholars will examine when they assess whether the American constitutional system is functioning as intended. The president's public statements, his social media posts, his press conference attacks, all of this is preserved in the permanent public record, available for future generations to examine when they assess the trajectory of American democracy. And that record is damning in its clarity and its consistency. A president who attacks the Supreme Court's legitimacy, who shames his own appointees, who threatens to rout around constitutional constraints, who sees the rule of law as an obstacle rather than a foundation. This is the specific behavioral accountability record that makes the scream's threats framing as authentic as any constitutional designation can be. Because the screams are real, the threats are documented, and the constitutional confrontation is unfolding in real time before our eyes. The content receipts that enable the most alarming available honest accountability delivery are as formally documented as any accountability receipts can be. The 6-3 Roberts opinion holding that IEPA does not authorize sweeping, peacetime tariff imposition and reaffirming congressional tariff authority is in the specific Supreme Court opinion record, available for anyone to read and analyze. Trump's specific public characterizations of the court as weaponized, unjust, and a disgrace are in the specific press conference and Truth Social statement record, available for anyone to examine. His specific statement that his own conservative appointees should be ashamed is in the specific press conference and social media accountability record, preserved for future scholars and citizens. His threats of higher tariffs, terrible things for countries that play games with the ruling, and alternative tools like licenses and new global tariff schemes are in the specific Truth Social posting and press conference record. And the legal analysis signaling tighter scrutiny on other areas, including spending and war powers, is in the specific legal commentary record, most directly establishing that the constitutional constraint implications extend beyond the specific tariff domain to the specific broader executive authority universe. The most practically alarming available accountability insight from the entire real 6-3 tariff ruling accountability story is the specific alternative tools retaliation claim insight most urgent available to the most credibly positioned content creators and most honest audience engagement. When a president publicly claims that a constitutional ruling limiting his specific authority paradoxically gave him more power through alternative tools, the most alarming available individual accountability statement is not the judicial attack on the court, but the specific retaliation planning accountability declaration, most directly signaling that the specific constitutional constraint being imposed is being actively routed around rather than accepted. That specific route around quality is the specific, most alarming, available, forward-looking accountability observation, most urgently establishing that the most devastating move yet framing is describing not merely a constitutional ruling, but a constitutional confrontation, whose specific, most alarming, forward-looking dimension is the specific act of presidential resistance to the specific constitutional constraint, most urgently distinguishing the documented accountability reality from any fictional, the court wins, and Trump accepts scenario. The Roberts holding that IEPA does not authorize sweeping peacetime tariff imposition, the reaffirmation that tariff authority belongs to Congress, Trump calling the court weaponized, unjust, and a disgrace. Trump saying his own conservative appointees should be ashamed, Trump threatening higher tariffs, terrible things, and alternative tools. Legal analysts signaling tighter executive power scrutiny on spending and war powers. Market and diplomatic accountability damage from the tariff invalidation. The cross-administration shrinking executive power arc from Biden's student loans to Trump's IEPA tariffs. The one-off clash versus sustained pushback accountability question, most urgently determining whether the devastating quality marks a constitutional turning point, and Trump's active route around resistance through alternative authority claims, most urgently establishing that the constitutional confrontation is ongoing rather than resolved. Those specific formally documented accountability elements together constitute the specific most alarming available real 6-3 tariff ruling accountability record, most urgently grounding the Trump screams threats as Supreme Court pulls most devastating move, yet framing in its most formally documented, available real-world accountability basis. Trump screamed threats and publicly attacked the Supreme Court after the 6,3 IEPA ruling stripped his tariff authority, then claimed the ruling actually gave him more power through other tools, a direct refusal to accept constitutional constraint. The clash between the court's binding ruling and the president's active resistance is the most alarming accountability confrontation of his second term, recorded permanently for history.